Thank you all so much for being here. What a wonderful time. I'm just so psyched. I wanted to talk to you today and tell you a little bit about the story of my own personal journey of how I became a composer. But it's not a story that's only about myself. It's a story about people that have inspired me and helped me find my own voice. And it's also about an incredible group of collaborators with whom I've been able to form my own musical community. But it's also about that larger community that exists outside of our classical music bubble. And one thing that I have come to realize is that building new audiences for classical music requires updating the very idea of the composer. From some kind of lone, fusty genius who's laboring away in isolation with a wig and a quill pen, and completely in this kind of purist remove, to somebody who is more of a cultural ambassador and a collaborator who is deeply integrated in the communities that he or she serves. So it didn't start with this idea. It actually started with a feeling, and that feeling was curiosity. I remember one of my first musical experiences that left a big impression was the first time that I heard a jazz group perform. And as someone who had mainly gone to classical concerts, which I also loved, I heard all kinds of things happening in this jazz performance that totally blew my mind. First of all, there was this incredible freewheeling sense of improvisation of a script that wasn't completely set in stone. And that was just a wonderful thing. But beyond that, there was something that I found so special, and there was this sense of rapport. And that's something that I have felt to some extent at that time in the classical world, but nothing prepared me for seeing a saxophone player take this amazing solo and end on a climactic high note. And at that moment, the audience bursts into applause. And that was exciting enough, but what I didn't expect is for that performer to draw energy from that applause. And it spurred him on to go and play something even more fantastic that I'm not sure would have happened without that interaction with the audience. So there's something very special and powerful there. And I often ask myself, why, when I go to classical concerts, don't I often feel these same kind of experiences? So a lot of my initial pieces of music were really concerned with this idea of figuring out how to update the classical world, and oftentimes some of the more conservative institutions like orchestras and opera houses, with some of the sounds and experiences and ways of interacting that are more typical of other kinds of folk and popular sources. Up here right now, you can see the fantastic string quintet Sybarite 5 performing my concerto beatbox with the South Carolina Philharmonic a couple of seasons ago. And I love working with Sybarite. I've worked with them for about 10 years now, and they're fantastic, really bold collaborators. And one of the reasons that I like to work with them is it involved a sense of building my own community, starting to find the right kind of performers that I needed to work with in order to express these ideas. And after this premiere, which is a whole lot of fun, I had an audience member come up to me, and she said something that really made me think. And it was, I really appreciated this piece of yours because it made me think differently about sound. And I thought, oh, that is so cool, because that's actually the reason that I write music. It's not to express an idea, it's not to express a philosophy or a polemic, or to respond to some pre-existing classical work or point of view, but it's simply a way for me to work through my own curiosity. And that takes many forms. It takes the form of my curiosity about sound and what it can do, but also curiosity about myself and my own limits. But more importantly, curiosity about that world outside of myself. And the more I thought about this, I decided that in my future works, I wanted to find a way to take this farther, that there was a way to not only bring in some of the special sounds and playing techniques for performers and concert works, but there might be a way to involve the audience more. So that was the next step, beginning to look at that and almost taking a kind of guerrilla tactic of, again, going to these more conservative and stodgy institutions and finding ways to invigorate that art form that I love so much with other things that I've found that I care about in music too. So this brings me to Andy. So Andy, a Popera was my first opera project, and this was premiered last season with Opera Philadelphia. And this was a fantastic project for several reasons. First of all, it involved a collaboration with singers from Opera Philly, but also with this wonderful experimental and gender-bending cabaret group called the Bearded Ladies. And for those who might be a little bit familiar with the cabaret tradition, what I think is so great about cabaret is that it has all kinds of historical background in terms of social critique, usually of the upper classes by the lower. It also includes a lot of interaction and often heckling. Often there's kind of a jokey and somewhat adversarial relationship with the audience. But I think that's what's often so entertaining is that cabaret often represents the kind of dark underbelly of emotions and things that we keep concealed from polite society. So in working with them to create this opera about Andy Warhol's life and enduring influence, I was really excited to look at how we could maybe bring in some more interactivity. And in researching Andy's life, one of the things that I was really excited to know more about is through all these incredible parties that he had at his factory loft in New York, he was always going around with a video camera. He was always observing. And I wanted to bring some of that into the show. So you can see here is the warehouse in North Philly where we had Andy. And you can see this is very different than the Kimmel Center. This is not how you would present grand opera. And the first thing is that we use the entire space. This is really immersive. There's not just stuff happening in front of you in this marked off area. It's happening to you. People are coming up behind you. You can't take it all in unless you participate. And then we played with this idea of the video camera. You can see that there's a large screen. We have a character who represented the young Andy Warhol who popped out of a box and filmed various audience members. And I did things like write little arias that were sung by singers off stage that expressed the audience members' supposed inner voices. And sometimes these would be things like, oh, crap, I thought this was Traviata, or hope there's an intermission, I really have to pee. But sung in a much more beautiful, florid soprano than I could muster. So that was a lot of fun, and there were some really, campy and quirky ways of working through this. But there was this one moment that hit me that was just, it moved me so much and was really chilling, the way that the music and the staging and everything all came together. And it was beautiful, and it wasn't campy. And it made me think of something that I hadn't felt for a long time. And it took me back to that first time that I had heard a jazz performance. And there was something about the arbitrary nature of the way that we often view the performer and audience relationship that really came across to me. And in reality, I think there's an argument to be made that all audience members are performers, in a sense. Just look at people getting dressed up to go to the opera. They're a kind of performance. And everyone who's performing is also an audience in a sense that they bear witness that's going on. And I think in the greatest performances of all genres of music and all arts, there's something of a two-way street that's created, not just something that's passively received, but something that is felt, something that is returned. And there's something about art to me that is really about seeing ourselves, seeing each other, and that knowing. And there's something about when we feel seen and when we feel heard, we think and act differently, right? So this made me think about, I had a lot of fun playing with these ideas on a more purely artistic level in terms of reaching out to the community of the audience within a work. But it really made me think about what I could do to maybe take this to a more social level in terms of how I built projects. So this brings me to the next thing I'd like to talk about, which was this wonderful concerto I had a chance to write for Mr. Shane Shanahan of the Silk Road Ensemble, who's obviously no stranger to DePauw. And like everyone in Silk Road, Shane is a master of instruments from all kinds of cultures and folk traditions. And in partnering with him, we were working with an organization in Cleveland called City Music. And City Music exists to kind of be a counterpoint to the Cleveland Orchestra, which is obviously a fantastic orchestra. They're touring a lot nationally, internationally, but not always so much hitting the most accessible venues. So City Music is really about hitting the accessible venues like gymnasiums, churches, presenting free concerts so that people who won't otherwise be able to hear that kind of music can get to it. So we had this great setup and this wonderful soloist, and in doing so, I started to ask questions. I had gone to school in Cleveland, but one of the things that I didn't know until I began to work on this project was that Cleveland is home to one of the nation's largest refugee populations, I think over 20,000 at the time that I was looking into it. So I thought about this, and I thought about this incredible connection to Shane, and I thought, well, there has to be a way to engage these different cultures and their music, especially with this particular musician. It seemed like the right fit. So I think if I would have approached this project 5 years earlier, I might have tried to write a piece of music that expressed something about the refugee experience and left it at that. But I didn't just want to do that. I wanted to learn from them because I'm not a refugee. I was born in a suburb of Chicago, and I didn't really understand their experience, even though I thought I did. So the first step was organizing activities, sharing sessions. We did activities where we worked on creating musical family trees from their home cultures that traced back important music and melodies from their family across generations and cultures. And in doing so, I came to understand how, while every refugee had a completely different story, there were certain common points on the way. There was always some reason that they left the home country that usually wasn't a very positive conditions that they were leaving from. There was always a kind of limbo in the refugee camps or this long process of coming over to the States. And there was always a sense of incredible joy and appreciation for this country, but also the challenge of not knowing the language, of learning how to find work and how to find other people. So I wanted to create a piece that actually took all these different stories and wove them together. So what we did is we decided we had to bring narration into this. So the piece is 5 movements that organized by each of these kind of major waypoints in the refugee journey, and the text for each combines several different stories from people of many cultures and finds the commonalities in that. So one of the things that I was really excited about in this project and the way that we dealt with it wasn't just having this piece of music, but it's that it left behind an infrastructure for innovation. And I think this is really important because it's one thing to go in and try to do some good, and that's better than nothing. But if you leave and those changes fall apart, then that's not ideal either. So one of the things I was really happy about through this project is there were a lot of distinct refugee groups that came from different cultures. They had similar needs, finding work, learning to acclimate, but they often came from different countries and had different languages. So by this project, they started working together and formed new refugee service collaboratives in the city. So that was wonderful. We also had the first ever festival of refugee folk music in the city, which I think was a wonderful thing, and has been going on. It will be the 3rd time it happens this spring coming up. So that was something too, and it really made me think that all this time I spent writing B flats was in a way misplaced. It was important. It's a very important part of the package. But there was also a sense in which a piece of art music is just one part, perhaps a central part, but one part of a constellation that goes far beyond that. And there's an opportunity in creating new pieces of music to look at what you can do beyond that. So I had a really good time on this project, and I think I learned so much from it. And I think one of my favorite things that happened is that this project helped identify really strong and active leaders within the refugee community who, many of whom, like William here, have been taking a larger role in leadership and various social services as a result of this project. So I am just so thankful for all of these brave people and how much I learned from them and grew as an individual. And not just because it accomplished so much, but I grew so much from it. I had a more enriching experience when I asked these questions than when I just sat and wrote whatever kind of piece that I wanted. That's actually not paradise for a composer, at least for me. What I'm really after is finding ways to connect with all kinds of people. And the City Music Project really helped me accomplish that. So I mentioned this idea of an infrastructure and how important that was. And for my last main topic, I want to talk a little bit about how, as a composer, I've had a chance to interact in concert curation and programming, and also as a member of an organization. In this case, as mentioned, Fifth House Ensemble, where I serve as composer and director of artistic programming. And one of the reasons that I was so happy to form this relationship with Fifth House is that the ensemble shares a lot of those kind of initial ideas I had been toying with about collaboration across genres, about commissioning new music and presenting it in interesting lights along with old works, but also this idea of reaching out and building community-based projects in many forms. So in doing this, I want to talk about just briefly 2 projects that Fifth House has done recently that I'm very proud of, and talk about the things that I think I was able to accomplish outside of this. Because I think as composers, we often get so stuck in the sense of, well, I create music, and that's very important, but there's a lot of other ways that composers can interact in the community and actually advocate for other composers or programming or music in different ways, and I find that very healthy. So the first project I want to mention briefly, well, here you will see some participants at our Fresh Ink Festival, which is a festival that we hold in Kenosha, Wisconsin, for people between the ages of 18 and 32, usually who are just kind of finishing up their so-called formal education. And they come and they spend 2 weeks with us, and we talk about how to build that career, a career that is unique to you in terms of reflecting your vision, but also your values, and how to make a life and career in music that isn't out of a cookie cutter, but really feels like it belongs to you. Right here you'll see a former student of mine, Sarah Grace Graves, playing accordion. And what she's doing is a composition workshop with some young students in Wisconsin, and they're creating compositions using a system of graphic notation with some color coding and some other things. It's more simplified than normal Western classical notation, but it allowed them to do all kinds of amazing things. And one of the things that I love about this structure is that I can't clone myself and be everywhere. Everyone in Fifth House is incredibly busy doing all kinds of things, but having the structure of training is so wonderful, not just for the good it does, but it allows us to almost create a pyramid and pass that down. And then we've often been thrilled to find that some of our former students will invite us to come to their school or form some kind of collaboration as well. So that ability to give back and to set other people off doing things, I think it has an exponential effect. It allows you to have a geometric impact instead of a merely arithmetic one if you stay a lone wolf. So I think that's something that's important. I want to talk a little bit about a program that we presented called Broken Text. And Broken Text started as a result of some educational residencies in Chicago. And we spent a lot of time collecting stories of diverse people all around Chicago, including those that had been incarcerated in the Chicago prison system. And in doing so, we had a lot of activities. Some of them involved things like writing letters to their former selves, but some of them involved creating songs or poetry and performing them. And as these were devised and worked on, we ended up partnering with a great organization called Raven Theater that helped combine this into a show. So this was really interesting and distinct from, say, the city music project that I mentioned, because in this project, we actually had our community partners take a hand not just in generating ideas, but in actually creating some of the musical content, and then had a role in shaping that into something that could be taken around that presented in many different contexts. So I want to speak briefly about some of the reactions to this, because according to our bassoonist in Fifth House, Eric Heidbreder, when they first started going in on their first trip, they often felt that everyone was being really shy and being very careful. But one of the biggest things that they realized is that there was this kind of calming effect, as many of the participants told them. And that's one of the greatest things that music can do, is it can put us in a place where reflection and thinking and change are possible. A lot of times that's very helpful when we're close to things that are very difficult, like violence and challenges at home. So this ability to weave these things together was fantastic, but it also was great because it helped these young people develop really important skills, reading, writing, communicating, but also how to talk about themselves and how to channel their feelings into productive works of art that could share and have an impact for others. So, and here's a photo of us together with some of these kids. So I think that this was really inspiring. And the other project I'd like to talk about, it's a little bit different, represents some of the other work we do, which is a lot of cross-genre collaborations. And there's this fantastic group in Chicago. It's a bluegrass band called Henhouse Prowlers. You can see them here. We have to thank our wonderful bassist and programs manager, Eric Snoza, for kind of discovering them and bringing them in. And one of the things that was really interesting about collaborating with them is that when we started figuring out what to do, we began by looking through this incredible body of bluegrass and folk music in the United States. And there was so much good stuff to pick from, but we found that we became more and more interested in a lot of the music of the Dust Bowl era. And there were a couple of reasons. Is that, first of all, there's some really great formative artists then, obviously Woody Guthrie and a lot of people that are very well known. But there was also something about how music was being used in a protest kind of way. It was being used to engage social issues. And it made us think about, well, obviously things are very different today than in the Dust Bowl era, but might there be some connections? What would happen if we talked to workers today, and how would their experiences be the same or different? So this seemed like an interesting question, but to do that, we had to partner again with some other organizations. And in this case, most notably, it was Latino Union in Chicago and Interfaith Worker Justice. And some of the members of our ensemble ended up trying to learn as much as they could, shadowing different workers. And we identified a lot of challenges that we would not have realized just standing on the outside by becoming embedded with them. And two issues that came up in particular were wage theft and also worker visas. In this case, the fact that oftentimes workers come over for very specific visa job descriptions. And if their employer changes that slightly, they are no longer eligible to be in the country. And that gives the employer a disproportionate amount of power to wield over them. So these were all things we were coming closer to. And in this case, it was interesting. There was a fantastic Woody Guthrie song that we ended up including in the program called Deportee, which was very much about some of the same kind of situations. So this ability to use programming to draw connections between what is new and what has happened. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in only seeing new music. I'm interested in new music playing a role in connecting to the great music of the past and bringing new light and meaning to that maybe wasn't there before. I think that's one of the reasons I like to see new music and old music blending. I think it tells a wonderful story that way. And something else about this project that I think was really fascinating is that it represented a chance for us to have a commission. In this case, a wonderful piece that we commissioned with the help of New Music USA from composer Stephen Snowden, who is remarkable. And those of you that were here when Fifth House has performed some of his music at DePaul will know how fascinating he is and how he likes to work with folk subjects. So he created a work for us called Voices from the Dust Bowl, which became the title of the show. And this work ended up being a work that was drawn from archival photography and recordings from the Smithsonian Folkways collection. So it literally took those voices of people from the Dust Bowl era and it allowed them to tell their own story and used music as a kind of backdrop and support to come in. So I think this was really remarkable thing for me because I realized it was one of the first times that there was a program that didn't have any of my own music on it, but the idea of coming full circle and playing a part in identifying a composer to commission with the group meant a lot to me. And I think it told me a lot about, again, how being a composer is a lot more than just writing your own music. It's looking out for other people in that community and building a community of people that you care about mutually. So when that happened, it made me think a little bit. And the last slide I have to show you is actually from Fifth House Ensemble's recent residency at DePaul for the Harvest Project, in which members of Fifth House went and interviewed people in the farming community in Greencastle. And here there's a couple members of our group talking to farmer Ron Sutherland, who was kind enough to share with the group some of the ways that farming has changed over the last 100 years as a result of advances in technology. And it really made me think, because I hear so much from our major arts organizations about how we have to increase ticket sales, we have to get butts in seats somehow. And what I would say to them is that until we in the classical music community go out and listen to the communities that we're trying to serve and find out what is important to them and find out what it is that we can do to help them, why on earth should we expect them to come and care about our own tiny bubble? So I think that we do need to have a resurgence of curiosity and creativity in terms of the music that we write and how we perform and present it, but also in terms of leadership and also in terms of vision and in capacity to care for other people, especially those that are most different from ourselves. And it makes me think about how all this started with composing being a way just for me to work through my own curiosity. And what that has become is a way to incept curiosity in other people. So to end this talk, I just want to return to that comment from an audience member that I mentioned earlier about how that piece that I wrote made her think differently about sound. Because therein lies the key to everything. Because if you can make people think differently about sound, you can make them think differently about themselves and their place in the world. And that's why music is and will always be one of our most powerful tools to help us envision the kind of world in which we want to live. Thank you.